Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on Healthy Brain. My name is Silvia, and I will be chairing this session. So by now, I believe you know the drill. So we have two exciting talks, 20 minutes each, and at the end, we're going to take the question possibly through the app, but we can also take some questions from the floor. If any of you is uncomfortable in using the app or doesn't want to speak into the microphone, we have Lauren here who is going to help you, so just wave and she will come to support you. But we're going to get started, so it is my pleasure to introduce the first speaker, so I'm going to call to the podium Cos Michael.
Hello, my name's Cos Michael and I'm an autistic speaker. Normally I talk about health and well-being for older autistic people. I have been involved with quite a lot of autism and aging research over the years, and I have some issues with it. And so today I want to talk about priorities. So I've said whose brain is it anyway? Whose mind is it anyway? So the first thing is, what's the aim of people who are trying to understand the autistic brain? Are they trying to normalize us? Are they trying to make us fit in, as we've heard so much about today already, because it's just too uncomfortable to have us being autistic all over the shop? Another question I have is, are they trying to cancel us? There is so much research going on that's genetic-based, and you just think, well, what are they trying to do? You know, on the one hand, we're talking about autistic people as being valued members of society, equal members of society, and all of that. So that, you know, we have the sort of social model. And on the other hand, we've got this vast industry that's looking at genetic engineering of autism and drugging autistic people to behave in a different way because it's not comfortable to have us being autistic all over the shop. So what is the aim of people trying to understand the autistic brain? Is autism research in some areas, the medical areas, going in the direction of Down syndrome, where I believe in Iceland there aren't any children being born with Down syndrome because parents have a choice and a fear when they become pregnant, and, you know, or are we trying to understand the value of the neurodivergent minds, or are we trying to just understand us for the sake of integration? You know, we are an equal part of society, or to translate research into practice, because as an older autistic person, I can tell you there is no practice, there is no support for older autistic people in this country. We're not mentioned in the Autism Act and Strategy. We're not mentioned in the Westminster Report. So in trying to understand us, are they trying to make life better for us? Because so far, you know, for older people, that's not the case. So I'm trying to just work out, does anyone, when they start researching autism, and particularly cognitive functions of autism, are people thinking before they start about where they want to finish, what their research is about? You know, is it an intellectual exercise that somebody is going to enjoy, or does it have a purpose? And if it has a purpose, what is the purpose? And that leads you to the who. Who controls the way that we're perceived? There are still the dinosaur sections of autism research where we are medicalized and deficit-laden language is used. There's autistic academics who are not doing that, though, and there are non-autistic autism academics who are not doing that. They're just regarding us as neurodivergent and as an interesting, you know, point of study, and for the best reasons possible. There's Joe Public. You know, we get it all the time. Holly was talking about it earlier, the way people are perceiving us. The media is doing some weird and wonderful things on that at the moment, in my opinion. On the one hand, you've got the sort of dating programs, and I wonder, are they just voyeuristic, or are they helping people understand autism? Then you've got the ADHD program that has just gone out, which I thought was quite valuable insofar as it gave autistic people a voice. So why do non-autistic people control the way the minds of autistic people are perceived? Because in the majority, we are still talked about, and our voice isn't always heard. And when it's heard, sometimes, in my opinion, it's cherry-picked for whatever the agenda is of the person who is listening to us. And part of that is obviously the deficient or different othering types of language that are used. We read and hear the way that we're referred to. We're in the room when we're talked about, where we can read what is said about us. We can read the deficit-laden language. It doesn't do us any good when we go out of doors, and it doesn't do us any good to our self-esteem, I can promise you. So we do really need to think about why the deficit language is used. So if you take away the deficit language, what might change? I mean, if it's used for a purpose. I think we've seen a lot of the purpose historically in research, but what happens if it's discontinued? Do we actually get to move from the medical to the social model? Are we going to start actually using research to support autistic people, to make autistic lives better? Will we get closer scrutiny of the medical research? Will there be a reduction of stigma? There's huge amounts of stigma when people are allowed to talk about us in the way that we're talked about. I mean, can you imagine talking about, I don't know, other people, other parts of the population in the deficit-laden language that's used to talk about autistic people? You know, you'd not get away with it. It's prejudicial. So attitudes towards autism might change quite a lot. We might become more included. Parental attitudes might change. And I'm not saying parents have a bad attitude. I'm saying that if you stop scaring parents, they might stop being so scared when they have an autistic child. And a lot of parents are very scared when they have an autistic child. And then there's our self-esteem. So I've got some questions, and these are perfectly normal questions that normal people ask about normal things. And it's basically about cognitive research, about some of the things that are missing in research. Why does so much research talk about autistic people? We're not one thing. We're not a lump. You know, we have different genders. And our lives are different because we have different genders. Why does cognitive research not differentiate enough between people with learning disabilities and people without? Because we know now that there are far, far more autistic people who do not have an intellectual disability than do have. And yet, in so much of society, you have learning disabilities and autism, or autism and learning disabilities as one word. It's all packed together, and that has an effect when you're looking at support. Because if you think that autistic people are autistic people and learning disabilities, as so many commissioners do, then there's no commissioning for autistic people without learning disabilities. And we miss out. We fall right out of the policy there. As we grow older, we get other conditions. And yet we talk about autism and aging. We talk about three sections of society. There are children, there are young people, there are adults. The adult section tends to start when we're about 25. A lot of the research tends to have a top age cap of participants, which tends to be 36 to 40, which means that all of adulthood, which can be 40 or 50 years, is one thing. Now, I am not the person I was when I was 25. My needs are different. Like anybody else, I have had a lifespan. I'm over 60. Why would you talk about me as if I was 25? Do you consider yourself as you were when you were 25 if you're 60? And if you're 25, do you think that you're the same as me? Really? You know, we have other conditions that come in as we age, but autism research tends not to notice those things. It tends not to notice the physical conditions of aging. It tends not to notice the way that we evolve within the family or within the workplace. There's an awful lot of adulthood research that talks about getting us into work. There's nothing that talks about getting us out of it as we retire. There's very little autism research that talks about us as members of families at all. I mean, when did you last hear this participant is an autistic grandmother? You know? They talk about social exclusion, but they don't talk about whether we're excluded socially out there or socially in the home, for instance, or isolation. So we're often treated as a homogeneous lump as we get older. And we're not. We're different people. We have different lives. We have different needs. And cognitive research needs to acknowledge that. And it needs to also talk about the skills, not just the deficits. And it's a wonderful thing how skills are translated as deficits if you're autistic. You know, if you do have the ability to delve deeply into a subject and explore it to its roots, you are hyper-focusing and it's a deficit. I don't understand it. However, has cognitive research started to benefit the autistic quality of life? I think it's beginning. I think it's turning a corner. I think it's turning a corner with a lot more new researchers, and autistic researchers are often leading the way with that. And I think that there is an evolution happening. What worries me is there's still this massive load of people who are trying to cancel us through genetic biomarker engineering, genetic engineering, gene therapies or whatever, CRISPR and drugs. So here's one of the ways I'm just going to run through a couple of the ways that I think it's beginning to change. We're now talking about autistic burnout. We're talking about that period a lot of people go through as a result of long periods of stress, lifelong periods of stress, accumulated stress, or stress in particular jobs where we're masking all the time or not allowed to be ourselves. There are a lot of negative impacts on us. And as we age, we get a bit tired. And in my instance, I'm getting a bit intolerant of it. But then older people are more intolerant, which I wasn't, by the way, when I was 25. Where does the research start? Where does it end? Why doesn't it transition throughout adulthood? Another is communication. It is now understood at last that if you have a conversation, there are two people in the room. And if one is having difficulty understanding the other one is also having difficulty. And if one is having difficulty communicating, then so is the other, because we're communicating in different ways. So talking about communication as a deficit is a bit of a problem. And that is borne out with Damien Milton's double empathy problem. He is again talking about the fact that with the best will in the world, we're not quite understanding each other all of the time. And it doesn't matter how hard we're trying, we often just don't get it. And sort of, why would we? It's like I've been asked, what's the difference between you and a normal person, a neurotypical person, or as people do say, a normal person? And I say, I don't know. I've never been a neurotypical person. How on earth are you expecting me to know this? And again, we have Dinah Murray and Wen Lawson's work on monotropism, that ability to focus. Now, it is said that we have this deficit, that we can't see the wood for the trees. We don't get the bigger picture. It's not that we don't get the bigger picture necessarily. Sometimes it's because when we're looking at a particular thing, we exclude the bigger picture because it's just too much incoming. But when we're not concentrating on a particular thing, we can see the world. Another of our deficits is hypervigilance, rather. So how can we be hypervigilant if we're not seeing everything? So I disagree with this being a deficit. We have a particular skill, a lot of us, of being able to look below the surface and to delve deep. And here's my bucket list. I want to see more about the autistic brain, please. I want a lot more research into autism and sleep. We know how important sleep is. We know how important it is for cognition, into Alzheimer's, into dementia. And before I get too old to be able to make sense of this, I want to be able to sleep better. And our problems are not the same problems as non-autistic people with sleep. We have different ones that are to do with sensory issues sometimes. It's not a simple matter of sleep hygiene. And also to do with things like rumination and imagination, I believe. And again, a lot of autistic people complain of brain fog. And then we have autistic burnout. Now, brain fog, when we just can't seem to clear our minds and think think properly, in a proper, do you know what? I think I've got brain fog. You know? That's what happens with brain fog. So we have burnout where we get too much incoming that adds up to nothing outgoing in the end, and we stop being able to function properly as we would normally do. And then there is this thing of brain fog, and are they connected? One thing may lead to another, but can you get the other without the first thing? Because there are a lot of physical conditions like fibromyalgia that could cause brain fog. There are various things that might cause it, and it's particularly interesting as we get older, because as soon as we start displaying it with white hair, you know, it's time for our medical clinicians to start thinking about dementia onset. And that's not necessarily that, and we wonder, a lot of us wonder how many autistic people are at the moment in wards for dementia, because they were never diagnosed, and their overwhelm has just been misrepresented as dementia, you know. So I also think that we need to think about alternative therapies for stress and anxiety, because in some cases, the antidepressants don't have the same effect for us, I believe. Having taken them myself for over a year, they don't make you less depressed, they just make you less. You know, they're a bit of a mental cosh for some of us. I'm not saying for everybody. But I think that drugs that alter the brain ought to be designed for the brain they're trying to alter. And I think the autistic brain might be rather different. So in the end, this sounds like a trite little end caption. Research needs to be relevant, or else it's irrelevant. And I think actually it's quite meaningful. If you don't know what your research is for, is it relevant? If it doesn't do anything for the people you're researching, is it relevant? If it doesn't meet acceptance with the people that you're researching, is it relevant? Because them doing it to us needs us to want them to do it. And for a very long time, we haven't had that sense of equality. We haven't had that much of a voice. We are of equal value. We are entitled to the same equality of services that every non-autistic person gets. But we can't get that unless people know what we are, what we look like, what our needs will be, what our future trajectory will be. You know, when we are ready to go into supported living, I hope they know more about us than when we were 25. It's irrelevant what we were like when we were 25. We do have the same rights to equality. We have them ethically, we have them in law. We need to be understood. We need to be supported like anybody else as we grow older. And we need the same equality as non-autistic people in that. So with 10 seconds to go, I will say thank you very much, and thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you.
Hey everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here. I recently found out I'm 50% Scottish after a 23andMe DNA test. So yeah, I'm back in the home of my ancestors, clearly. My name is Dr. Rachel Gow. For those that don't know me, my background, research and training is in nutritional neuroscience. I also qualified as a child neuropsychologist at King's College London. I'm a registered nutritionist and I am an author of a newly published book called Smart Foods for ADHD and Brain Health. If anyone is interested in nutritional neuroscience, you can follow me on nutritious_minds over on Instagram. Okay, so let's see if this works. Okay, I'm not going to go into my background and training because I've only got 20 minutes. Again, this is my book, a little plug there, sorry. Sophie and I have known each other for 17 years. I first met her through my wonderful ex-boss who is seated right on the front row staring at me, so I'm not under any pressure to do a great job. But I just want to share a little tiny bit about my personal story. So I was adopted at 6 months of age. The adoption placement was a little bit of a genetic mismatch, if there's such a thing. Anyway, I went to live with my best friend when I was 15 years of age, and then I became a young mum, and this is me with my son Nathaniel, who I named Gift from God, because he really felt like a gift, and I clung on to him like the precious goods that he was. Anyway, I was a young, first-time, busy mum working on the very famous Abbey Road in St John's Wood, North West 8, where I had a very enjoyable and quite lucrative career, given that I had a disruptive education myself, and I went straight to work, and I worked extremely hard, and my son was at a small private school around the corner. I was fortunate enough to earn enough money to put him there, and it suited him because he was quite quirky, and he was very mischievous. He was exceptionally bright. You know, when he was 5, he would say to me, "How does a light bulb work, Mummy?" And all sorts of questions like that, which I was ill-equipped to answer. Literally, I stocked his bookshelves of encyclopedias and, you know, had to sort of join in terms of which planet was closest to Earth and Pluto and Neptune and all the rest of it. Anyway, his disruptive behaviour, or I like to say mischievous behaviour, got him into trouble, and there was frequent and repetitive phone calls by the school and fixed terms, exclusions, and so on and so forth, and that led to him being diagnosed with ADHD. It's quite chronic. He was quite severely hyperactive and impulsive, but he was a lot of fun, and he was also dyslexic, and he was probably also bordering on the autistic spectrum as well, but back then they didn't give dual diagnoses. So that's a little of my personal story, and now on to the science. So I'm going to talk about the role of nutrition in the brain and many features of what's called the modern Western diet, or the standard American diet, also known as the SAD diet, are described as evolutionary, novel, and pathological. So there is a global pandemic and huge rises in non-communicable diseases, and that includes type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on and so forth. And the WHO have publicly announced that most of these are by and large preventable. And guess how? Arguably, one of the most single, easiest modifiable risk factors is, of course, changing the diet. These ultra-processed foods are non-nutritive compounds, often containing synthetic artificial additives which have zero nutritional value, as well as colorants and flavorings and dietary emulsifiers which are not well regulated, especially in America. In fact, I've just done a huge project with some Americans that I work with, one of which is Professor Robert Lustig, who wrote Metabolical and The Hijacking of the American Mind, about the impacts of ultra-processed foods. We're about to publish that, so do look out for that in Frontiers. And I actually looked at all the food additives and their potential harms, and especially among the neurodivergent community. So, junk foods don't just affect the body in terms of physical health. You know, often nutrition is just from the neck down, but the brain has biochemical underpinnings, and there are certain nutrients, which I have coined brain-selective nutrients, which impact the brain at molecular and cellular levels. So it's really important to remember that. And the field that I work in, the field of nutritional psychiatry, have been advocating that nutritional medicine must be mainstream in psychiatry. So when you present to the GP, what normally happens is you're read a checklist of symptoms, maybe from a computer screen. Certainly that's been the way in America, and I've spent a lot of my career in America as well. And you know, the prescription pad is likely to come out if you've reached a certain threshold, and you're likely to be given some sort of prescription for a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or some other similar antidepressant sent on your way. If you're lucky, you may get referred to talking therapy and told to come back in 6 months. But the question, what do you eat, seldom features in that conversation of your mental health evaluation. And we want to advocate that everyone presenting with a mental health concern should be simultaneously referred to a dietitian or a nutritionist like myself, because we now know, and we've known for some time, that underlying much of all psychiatric, I don't like the word illness or disability or conditions, but that's how, you know, obviously it's difficult to reframe it, but you know what I'm talking about. Underlying much of all poor mental health is inflammation in the brain. And inflammation in the brain is linked with an increased risk of various conditions, especially depression, anxiety, and also with ADHD. So the archaic view was that food was simply energy for the body. Of course, it's so much more than that. You know, poor diet is associated with functional and structural differences, and we know that through decades of neuroimaging research. And, you know, it impacts cognition, mood, ability to learn, behavior. And arguably children are the most vulnerable because, you know, and I'm guilty of this as a parent myself, we reward children with, you know, sugar and, you know, junk foods for good behavior. I mean, that's what I used to do, admittedly. You know, when my son was small and I had no idea about the effects of foods, we see toddlers as young as 3 with a bag of crisps in the buggy, sucking on a lollipop, you know. Yet now we know that sugar activates the exact same reward circuitry as Class A drugs, yet we're rewarding 3-year-olds for it. As Dr. Robert Lustig quotes, my colleague and dear friend in America, sugar is the new alcohol for the children. And if you want to know more about his work, do go to YouTube and type in "Sugar, the Bitter Truth." So sugar is bad for the gut, as is dietary emulsifiers as well. What we know is that sugar feeds specific pathological strains of bacteria, and what it does over time is it can erode the protective lining of the gut, which can then lead to systemic inflammation in the gut and create all sorts of behavioural disturbances. And that condition is also known as gut dysbiosis. And dietary emulsifiers, there's a whole wealth of research coming out now showing, you know, that these ultra-processed foods, which are stuffed full of dietary emulsifiers, really can lead to gut dysbiosis. So it's a serious thing. Also, food additives. I run a clinic called Nutritious Minds. I also set up a non-for-profit organisation called Nutritious Minds Trust. And what I do is families come to me and I send them off to a laboratory and they're tested for nutritional insufficiencies in a range of brain-selective nutrients like iron, iodine, zinc, magnesium, selenium, omega-3 fatty acids, and so on, and also tested for nutritional intolerances and food allergies. And literally, like 95% of all the families I've worked with, their children present with all of these. So we know already they're overrepresented, and food additives need much tighter regulation. I've just listed literally just a few of them there for you. So why are we here? You know, why is it taken so long for people to start thinking about what they put in their body also affects their brain? Well, Sheila Dixon, who's a BBC journalist, very bravely published this in 2018. And she said the reason that is because our medical students who become our family practitioners and GPs only receive 2 hours training on nutrition. So when you go to your GP and you complain about low mood or irritability, they're not necessarily going to tell you about gut health or the gut-brain axis. And the 85% of serotonin is made in the gut and transported via the vagus nerve directly into the brain. And if you are eating junk and processed foods, your gut health is going to be disturbed and you need to actually heal your gut. They're not necessarily going to tell you to go and get some omega-3 supplements, even though the effect size of EPA-rich formulations is greater than cognitive behavior therapy and antidepressants combined. It has an effect size of 0.61, and that was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in 2015 by Dr. Hallahan and colleagues of mine at the NIH, where I used to work. So this is where we're at. This is where we're at. We know that vitamin D has a moderately favorable antidepressant effect. You know, we know nutrition and exercise work in synergy to release endorphins, our body's natural antidepressants, you know, which flood our brain with GABA, the calming hormone, dopamine, you know, that motivates us to get out of bed in the morning, serotonin that enables us to feel contentment and happy. We know, again, that children with ADHD and autism do have lower levels. You know, that research is out there. Just go to PubMed and, you know, type in nutritional insufficiencies or dietary patterns, you know, and see what pops up over 1,000 research articles. So nutritional tests do not yet feature in mental health evaluations. I hope they do. But you can luckily buy tests online that you can test yourself at home and look at your own levels. So I'm just cherry picking some of the data today. So this was by Felice Jacka and her colleagues, and she was the first person to show that individuals following a Western type ultra-processed food diet habitually had alterations in their hippocampus. And of course, the hippocampus is that seahorse structure in the brain, which is so important for learning and memory, but also for neurogenesis. You know, neurogenesis is the birth of new neurons, which continues throughout adulthood. So, for example, at my age, I have replaced every single neuron that I was given at birth. So you know, and that's the process of neuroplasticity, and it enables us to keep learning. Again, poor diets are associated with poor performance, and so on. So I've already mentioned this, you know, certain nutrients can help optimize your neurotransmitter function, and it's important that everyone knows that. I've already mentioned that, you know, 85% plus of serotonin is made in the gut. We've got to keep our gut healthy as well. I could talk about this all afternoon, but I don't have time, I'm afraid. There are healthier ways to regulate our neurotransmitter function. You know, humans are master manipulators of the brain's biochemistry, and especially those that are undiagnosed ADHD, you know, they will tend to, well, they're 50% more likely to self-medicate through stimulant illicit substances. You know, caffeine is the most common probably, but then the illegal ones, you know, like cocaine, marijuana, you know, nicotine, and so on. So we need to try and, you know, provide healthier options to regulate our brain's neurotransmitter systems. I mean, obviously the human brain is wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. That is the way it's wired. So we're always trying to normalize our brain's biochemistry by whatever means possible, because, you know, dopamine enables us to feel great. It gives us that little high, you know, that hit of dopamine, and we feel euphoric and we go back for more. I think I'm running out of time. Am I running out of time? We've got a couple more minutes. A few more minutes. Okay, so I just want to say that the brain is the fattiest organ in the human body. It's made of complex, specialized, unique fats called lipids, and around 25% of all your brain cells are made up of an omega-3 highly unsaturated fatty acid called docosahexaenoic acid, also known as DHA. So if you think about it like this, we've got about 100 billion neurons in our brain. Each of those neurons is coated in a fatty sheath, a myelin sheath, and that is made up of DHA. And it acts as an insulator around our neurons to literally speed up our communication systems, making for faster and more efficient chemical messaging across our brain's network. It also plays a role in the regulation of both the serotonergic and dopaminergic systems of our brain, so it enables us to regulate our levels of serotonin, which make us feel content and calm. We need to be eating at least 500 milligrams a day, but the American Psychiatric Association recommend at least 1 gram a day for any type of mood disturbances, low mood. When I did my neuroimaging omega-3 clinical dietary intervention trial at the National Institutes of Health with adults with ADHD, we supplemented them with 3 grams. The FDA say up to 3 grams a day is safe and tolerable. Yeah, I've already mentioned this, but I just want to show you this. This is 2 slides from cell-cultured hippocampal neurons, and what that shows directly is those given adequate amounts of DHA have a nice, healthy pattern of dendritic branching, that kind of tree-like pattern that enables faster and more efficient cell signaling, versus the picture that has a DHA inadequate. So you can see visually there what it does to the neurons in your brain. Also, it can cause something called a disruption or a delay in neuronal migration, and that's just the predetermined position that your neurons arrive at in the developing cortex. And you can see, in contrast to the pattern on the right, this is a cortex, picture of a cortex. It also, inadequate omega-3 can cause 40 to 60% depletion of dopamine in the frontal cortex and nucleus accumbens, and obviously ADHD. The medical model is the kind of dopamine deficit hypothesis, which again I won't have time to go into, but we know omega-3 during childhood can result in improvements in visual acuity, improvements in problem solving, improvements in sleep, improvements in ADHD symptoms, and so on and so on. We also know persistently that low omega-3 has been found in young people, children. My own work at King's College London showed highly statistically significant differences between children with ADHD and children without ADHD. My neuroimaging clinical trial at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland, also showed that adults with ADHD had an omega-3 index of only like 4.1%, which is in the kind of suboptimal group. So this research, again, over and over, there are now meta-analyses demonstrating this over and over. We know that the largest body of evidence for efficacy is in ADHD and depression. I've already mentioned the depression, so I'm not going to go into that. This is just the results of my neuro trial, which showed increased activations in specific regions of the brain associated with emotion and reward networks. The balance is absolutely critical of omega-3 and omega-6. So omega-6 is in those ultra-processed foods. It's in your cakes, your pastries, your biscuits, your pizza bases, via the inclusion of soybean oil. And because these two work, they're in competition for absorption and synthesis into our red blood cells, so they compete. So if you take a 1 gram fish oil tablet, but you're eating junk and processed foods, you're probably going to be getting in the region of 12 to 17 grams of omega-6 versus that 1 gram of omega-3. So that 1 gram of omega-3 is not even going to be absorbed. You might as well chuck it down the toilet. It's a waste of your money. What you have to do is simultaneously reduce your intake of omega-6s and elevate your intake of omega-3s. I've already said this, so have I got enough time to talk about maturation or delay hypothesis? Okay, what I would say is do look up the work of Dr. Philip Shaw. He's one of the pioneers in the neuroimaging literature in ADHD, and he has done brain imaging with the children, with their parents, with the grandparents, and he's followed them up longitudinally, and he's assessed differences in cortical thickness, and he has put forward this maturation or delay hypothesis which is, can be explained as like a developmental lag in children, which explains the kind of age-inappropriate behaviour that ADHD comes with. And it's important to remember that the frontal cortex of the brain is the last part of the brain to fully mature. It doesn't actually stop maturing until the ages of about 23 to 25. And also, during puberty, there's this constant conflict between the frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that says, let's think about this first, and the limbic system, which is the oldest, more primitive part of the brain, which is literally ignited during puberty. It's the accelerator, and it's saying, wouldn't it be fun if we did this? It's involved in those risk-taking, you know, sensation, novel-seeking behaviours. So there's this conflict between the two systems, and if that frontal cortex is not fully mature until 23 to 25, then it's important to understand that some of the struggles and how very real they are. Okay, so all of this is going to go hopefully onto the internet. There's lots of good advice about specific nutrients that you should be monitoring and making sure that you've got adequate amounts of in your diet. And unfortunately, I did originally think I had 30 minutes, so I've only got 20 and I've gone over, so I do apologise. But before I finish, I just want to dedicate this talk today to one of my best friends who very sadly passed away on Saturday. So this is in memory of Jason Kay. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
So, thank you again to both speakers for their insight, but also because they both shared their personal experiences, and that's really made the talk much more relatable. So thank you again. So we have a number of questions, and I'm going to try to group them a little bit, because we cannot possibly go through all of them. But just so that Rachel catch her breath, I'm going to start with Cos. So, and that's the first question for you. This is from somebody. Well, I'm just going to read it, so that's easier. So, I researched more question coming. I researched the cognitive profile of autistic people with dementia to improve the way dementia is assessed. So the question is, how can I ensure this makes the right impact for autism?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question.
So this is somebody who is doing research in cognitive profiling with people with autism, but to do dementia research. So the question is, how do we how can this person ensure that this type of research does have a true impact for people with autism when thinking about the progression and getting into dementia?
There is research on autism and dementia. Mm-hmm. There is a theory that the autistic brain has a protective quality against dementia. That doesn't mean that autistic people don't get dementia. It means that the way our brains function means that if and when we get dementia, we may cope with it slightly differently. Now, I'm not sure about that. I have no idea. I'm not a researcher. Mm-hmm. You have to take that into mind. I think the more we understand the autistic brain as a difference, the more likely we are to diagnose people who have that brain, and therefore the less likely we are to make assumptions, false assumptions, about how they are progressing. I also think, and I may be completely wrong with this, but I also think a lot of the research at the moment into autism and dementia is there for the purpose of helping non-autistic people cope with dementia, rather than for the purpose of helping autistic people cope with dementia. I hope I'm out of date in that, but I do believe that that's the way it used to be. So how can you differentiate? Well, the more you know about the autistic mind, the more likely you are to see something. I remember talking to a gerontologist, psychiatrist from Newcastle, who said that she often had people referred to her for a dementia diagnosis, but she happened to know quite a lot about autism, and she recognized the fact that a lot of them had just had a meltdown not autism. And in some cases, in fact, she said in most cases when they were autistic, she was the first person to diagnose them, because historically, children who didn't have a learning disability were not diagnosed as autistic. So as we've grown older, it's why you have so many late diagnosed people of my age. As we've grown older and the diagnostic criteria has broadened, you know, we still have a lot of people of my age and older and younger who do not have a diagnosis. So it's very hard to know whether or not they've been referred for other reasons than dementia.
Thank you. So maybe having longitudinal studies where we can follow people might be a way to...
There's a slight problem with longitudinal studies, as most of them will take different people at different ages and then call that longitudinal, and it's not. They're not taking one person as they age. The trajectory is not the same.
Okay, thank you. So for Rachel, there have been quite a number of questions on this topic, so sugar. So because I think through the talk you mentioned sugar many times, but people would like to have some clarification on what you mean with sugar. Is it all carbohydrates? And if you can make a distinction of what you mean with sugar.
Yeah. So my recommendations are to avoid white refined sugar because it's highly processed. Obviously it's bleached, you know, sugar is not white. And yeah, basically, obviously, its links to metabolic disease are only now recently being confirmed, and there's a lot more on this topic, which is going to be in our scientific paper that is being published by Frontiers called The Impacts of Ultra-Processed Foods in Metabolic Health. But one of the leading authorities, as I mentioned, is my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Lustig. So do go over to YouTube and watch Sugar the Bitter Truth, or also read his book Fat Chance, or Metabolical, or The Hijacking of the American Mind, and he goes into all the science there. But I would always say, try and wean yourself slowly off sugar. You know, swap, if you can, to Demerara, something that's more raw and organic, or use stevia, and just slowly reduce it. Because then when you do that over a period of time, when you actually have sugar, like in a cup of tea, honestly, it will taste so disgusting, you end up spitting it out. So, yeah.
Conversion therapy.
Okay, so I'm just going to stick with Rachel, because I think this is, again, part of quite a number of questions on this topic about choice of food, and I can see two themes here. One is the cost of living crisis, because how can we afford nutritious food? But also, people suggest they have their safe food, and quite often these safe food tend to be junk food. So how do we make this balance between eating healthy but also eating something that make us feel okay?
Well, the only reason junk food tastes so good is because they've hired some of the top research scientists in the world who have cleverly concocted chemical combinations. I mean, I always say to like the young people I work with, you know, get that Dorito and wash the crap off it and then put it back in your mouth and it tastes like cardboard. Or get a McDonald's, put it in a NutriBullet, blend it. Are you going to drink that? Like, seriously? The stench will put you off for life. Like, these foods are harming our bodies and our brains, and the more we realise that ultra-processed foods is just a complete con. It's not going to go away, but what we need to do is we need to re-engineer convenience foods so that they're healthier and they contain ingredients and formulations which are metabolically healthier, because we are doing such a disservice to consumers, because the food additives that are hidden, people don't understand the labels. You know, half of these E numbers, people don't understand what they are. They don't understand the harms. You know, there's loopholes that companies get away with, not even registering some of the food additives. So it's a lot of work needs to be done. And I think just get back in the kitchen, make meals from scratch. You know, ditch the breakfast cereals, make yourself an omelette, scrambled eggs, you know, there are foods that you can make which are not expensive and are healthier.
Okay, so I can see lots of questions coming. So this is quite a hot topic. So I'm sure Rachel is gonna pick this up and probably answer individually because we are coming to the end of the question. But I really see the also comments coming along, and I'm sure our speaker are going to be able to get back to you and through the app.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone does have any questions, just message me at nutritious_minds and I'll reply personally. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you again to the speaker, and thank you everybody, and everybody also who sent the question to this great session. Okay.